DK Metcalf is a $31 million cap hit next year. They save $11 million if they move on from him. And I just think that with some of his limitations as a player, the important part of this conversation, I think, is reminding people that I don't think DK Metcalf is bad at football. But this is about opportunity cost, and it's about which avenues you open up for yourself in terms of roster building if you make some of these hard decisions. And if you were to trade DK Metcalf, and just in this hypothetical, let's say you get a second or a third round pick, just to, I think, being realistic. You save $18 million in cash. That's his base salary, and you save $11 million against the cap. I think you can make a really solid argument that not only for the 2025 Seahawks, but for 2026, 2027 Seahawks, what you could do with the resource allocated to DK Metcalf spread around to a couple different positions is actually in the best interest of the overall roster health for this team in both the short and medium term.
That is the voice of Robert Mays of The Athletic. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. And Robert, it's so great to have you back. That was listening to you from December 23rd before the epic battle between the Seahawks and the Bears in Chicago. How are you doing on this fine Thursday?
I'm doing okay. This week has been a little bit more hectic than I think I was probably ready for, given that it, in theory, should be the calm before the storm next week. But it's all right. It's been fun. There's been a lot of stuff to kind of kick around.
Well, it's really good to see you. And as you listen back to your wise words from during the season, curious if your thoughts have changed at all now that, as of yesterday, DK Metcalf has officially requested a trade from the Seahawks.
Nope.
Well, we're done. We're done here.
I think what I said in that moment, I kind of stand by. I think the only concern, as I listen to myself, I hate listening to myself. It makes my skin crawl. But
you're welcome.
Thank you very much. I listened back to most of our shows, so I put myself in that position almost every day. But listening back to that, the only thing that gives me a little bit of pause is looking at the available receivers just in a vacuum. There just aren't many. And so if you're going to replace him, I think two things have to be at front of mind. As part of that trade, hypothetically, let's say you deal him to Green Bay. Can you get a Romeo Doubs back in a deal like that? So you at least have a starting caliber receiver as part of the compensation. Or two, does that put you in a place where you need to make sure you come out of the draft with a usable receiver? And that's never really a good place to be. So I stand by the fact that the opportunity cost with the pick and the salary may be better spent elsewhere. But I could also understand Seahawks fans looking at a reality without DK Metcalf and that making them a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, it certainly, we're hearing it from all sides on this one, Robert. We're talking to Robert Mays of The Athletic. And I'm curious, I mean, the way that this kind of came about, it does not seem like the Seahawks necessarily wanted to trade. My interpretation of talking to John Schneider, Mike McDonald, Clint Kubiak, this guy is someone that they plan to be a central part of their offense. It was part of their offensive coordinator interviews about how are you going to accentuate DK Metcalf. John Schneider has been pretty dismissive about the idea when people have asked him, even last week at the Combine, about this notion of trading DK Metcalf. And then DK Metcalf's camp came out yesterday and was like, we want to trade. So what is your interpretation of what's going on here between these two sides? And are you of the mindset that this is going to end up in a trade? Or do you think this could wind back around and actually lead to them making a deal?
I think this is just him wanting a new deal and the Seahawks being a little bit hesitant about meeting his potential asking price on a new deal. And when that happens, and we see this all the time, just requesting a trade doesn't mean you're granted a trade. I mean, this is a consistent theme in the NFL. Remember that I'm old enough to remember the Brandon Ayuk saga from last year, and I remember how the Brandon Ayuk saga ended up. So it's not a clean path to getting traded, even if you're a little bit unhappy with the way the contract negotiations have gone. At a certain point, the team has the leverage, right? Unless you want to take this thing the distance, and I doubt DK Metcalf does. So if the Seahawks truly do want to keep him, they're in a position where they can probably make that happen. It's just a question of how steadfast they want to be in seeing out that path through.
Do you think that it's to the point that the Seahawks are just have a lower number for an extension than what DK Metcalf wants? Or do you think there's a chance the Seahawks do not want to spend what it will cost to extend a receiver at his level for a third contract. And that's maybe more of a philosophical difference, and maybe that there's not even an offer that they're willing to make.
There's probably an offer they're willing to make. I would guess that the tension, and again, this is all just conjecture, but I would guess that the tension is probably in looking at what's happened at the receiver market, looking at what guys like his college teammate A.J. Brown or guys like CeeDee Lamb, guys like Justin Jefferson are getting paid. And DK Metcalf is probably sitting there saying, I'm as good as those guys. Like, I'm as important as those guys. And I could understand the Seahawks saying, not sure you are. Not sure you deserve the same sort of compensation, the same sort of trade package, et cetera. I mean, the idea this morning that came out, I think it was Diana Rossini reported that it was going to be a first and a third, that was going to be the price that it would take to get DK Metcalf away from the Seahawks. Well, the Eagles traded a first and a fourth for A.J. Brown 3 years ago when A.J. Brown was younger and a better player than DK Metcalf is. So somewhere along the way here, I think that there are some inconsistencies on how people see DK Metcalf as a player and what he actually is.
Yes. Well, I think the Seahawks are almost counting on that, because on one hand, they're in a bit of a difficult position here, Robert, in that on one hand, they're saying, well, we're not going to pay you like those guys. On the other hand, we want you to be traded for what those guys would return in draft comp. So it's a little bit of a challenging story to tell. You mentioned the Brandon Ayuk situation. I'm interested in what comps do make sense for you, because Brandon Ayuk was in the last year of his deal. He did want out. That happened after the draft. And, as confirmed by Albert Breer, at least reported by him, the Steelers had offered a second and a third. The Patriots had offered a second and a third, and maybe Kendrick Bourne. There's a third team that also offered something along those lines. Is that the most relevant comparison to the DK Metcalf age value thing, or is there another receiver that kind of comes to mind as a good comp?
It's a really good question. I think in a vacuum, Brandon Ayuk is a younger and better player than DK Metcalf, personally.
Mm-hmm.
I would rather have Brandon Ayuk on my team than DK Metcalf. And so I don't think that price tag is necessarily in line with what DK Metcalf is worth. I don't know if there is a good one-to-one comparison. And I feel like because he's a little bit older, I'm going to throw out a player that costs less. I think I'd be more comfortable giving him something like the Nico Collins contract than I would giving him something like the CeeDee Lamb or A.J. Brown contracts. I think that's more in line with what he actually is for an NFL offense. I honestly think you'd make an argument that Nico Collins is more valuable than DK Metcalf is right now. And Nico Collins got $24 million a year on the extension he signed last offseason, which is probably a bad deal on his part. But I think that there are better comps than the guys at the top of the market.
So when you look at a guy like DK Metcalf, and they're, as you've mentioned, fans are wiser than they've been. They have access to more data. Teams as well have access to a lot of this information. And if you just look at DK Metcalf and his production, there's a lot of cases to be made that it's not at this elite level. There are some cases you can make. He's done things that only Randy Moss has done in his first 6 seasons, depending on how you want to play it. But Robert, you know as well as I do that owners play a role in this. There is an emotional aspect, and there's this notion of, is there a single coach or a single GM in the NFL that doesn't look at DK Metcalf, the athlete, and think, man, I don't want that guy on my team, or man, I don't think I could make that guy better than what he has been? Do we have a situation here where you've got all these other front office folks looking at DK Metcalf and salivating at the idea of having one of the NFL's best athletes, maybe thinking that they can unlock something that he hasn't had been unlocked yet, and have this all happening in this offseason where for the first time in a while, the free agent class is pretty gross at the receiver position, and the wide receiver class in the draft is middling. It's definitely not last year, and it's not the year before. Do you think that could net, someone making maybe a little bit of a silly offer that wouldn't necessarily make sense if you just look at the pure production?
I think that there are probably teams out there who are looking at the available receivers and thinking a high 2 plus an extension for DK Metcalf, that's worth it to me. Mm-hmm. I think a team like the Patriots comes to mind, right? Mm-hmm. When you have this ocean of cap space, there's no way you can spend it all in free agency, and you need some competency at receiver. Like that's a team that makes more sense to me than somebody like the Steelers, right? Where the Steelers they just don't really operate that way. I feel like there's not that level of desperation. Even like if you're the Packers and you look at, all right, would we rather have DK Metcalf than Christian Watson because of how reliable he is, how often he stays on the field? You're essentially getting like a souped up version of Christian Watson that you know is going to be available. That's understandably attractive if you're the Packers, but the price you'd have to pay for that upgrade, is that worth it, considering what else you could do with those resources? So I feel like it's going to be teams that don't see another avenue to a receiver or to a build that would involve DK Metcalf, right? If you're the Patriots and you trade for DK Metcalf, and now you can use the 4th overall pick on an offensive tackle, and you have so many holes to fill. Those are the teams, and those are the teams at that point in their team building process that I would probably be looking at first and foremost.
Do you think that there's the other side of this, which is teams that are maybe closer to contending, maybe a Chargers team that that obviously needs some help at receiver? Or I'm curious if there's these teams that are so close and looking to get over the hump. I'm thinking about a Baltimore, a Buffalo, where they're already picking at the back end of the first round. It's basically a high second anyway. And they're thinking about what their picks would be if the Seahawks were to ask for a not 2025 pick, but they're asked for a 2026 first round pick or something along those lines. Can you see one of those teams saying, okay, this is the guy that's going to get us over the hump?
It's hard for me to imagine that, because I think that those teams are smart enough where you're looking at the all-in price and just deciding that it's not worth it. Like I think too often this is what happens, where people are going to look at this, and let's say DK Metcalf gets traded for the 35th pick in the draft. You think, well, he's better than the 35th pick in the draft. Well, that's not the math that we're doing. The math that we're doing is it's the 35th pick in the draft plus a top of market extension that you are now incentivized to give him because you just traded something for him. And that price tag, that's a lot. Like it is really, really difficult to play well enough to overcome that sort of price tag. And I think that the AJ Brown thing is a good example to me. Like the Eagles traded a 1st and a 4th for AJ Brown and then gave him a contract extension. AJ Brown has been a superstar level player. Like he has played up to that level. But with that sort of return, if you're going to pay that plus an extension, you need somebody to play at that sort of level for it to make sense.
So when you look at this overall situation with receiver, I actually think you and I might have talked about this at the beginning of the season. It's been bizarre to me that in a supply and demand kind of world, that the receiver position has been skyrocketing in contract value while you're seeing draft class after draft class after draft class just infuse the NFL with young, cheap receiving talent. And now you've got Brandon Ayuk potentially on the trade block a year after signing that deal. You've got DK Metcalf potentially getting traded. You've got a number of like Devontae Adams back on the market. Do you think that there's a chance that maybe there's a little bit of a calibration going on relative to the receiver value after a season in which, you know, running kind of came a little bit back more in vogue and trench play become a little bit more back in vogue? Is that at all what's going on here?
Maybe a little bit, but I still feel like teams that we thought were going to let go of their receivers didn't end up doing that, right? Like T. Higgins just got franchised when we thought that the Bengals were going to let him go. We haven't really seen any receivers hit free agency. Like we'll see if they end up trading DK Metcalf, but all of these receivers, these star receivers who theoretically have been available, ultimately haven't changed teams. I mean, for the most part, these guys who have been top of the market caliber players of the position have gone back to where they were, like Chris Godwin going back to the Bucks a few years ago, Mike Evans going back to the Bucks last year. Teams continue to retain these guys, and free agency continues to be a tough avenue to add receivers. And I think it's a little bit like the quarterback situation where, yeah, theoretically, like, should you not pay $53 million a year for Tua because you can get, if not comparable quarterback play, then quarterback play that is more cost effective than that? If you just drop somebody else into that offense, maybe, but teams aren't willing to do that out of self-preservation. Like you don't want to be the guy who walks away from it. Like we've seen this happen twice, right? Where a team has traded like a star receiver for a first round pick. And we've seen it work out two different ways. The Vikings did it with Stephon Diggs, and they got Justin Jefferson, and everything is great. On the other side of it, the Titans traded away A.J. Brown. They drafted Treylon Burks, and their general manager got fired immediately after their team played against A.J. Brown. So I think that potential downside where you're letting a really, really good player walk out the door, even if in theory there should be enough supply to make up for that right now, I think that there's enough of a chance where it doesn't happen that teams aren't necessarily willing to do it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think one of the factors here is John Schneider has had a pretty good track record at the receiver position. He's had Golden Tate, he's had Tyler Lockett, he's had DK Metcalf, Paul Richardson, a number of other guys, Doug Baldwin, Jermaine Kearse, all down the line. But I guess hearing you talk about it, Robert, I'm kind of wondering, what do you think the best outcome is here for the Seahawks? In the sound that we played at the beginning, you were talking about how maybe the best thing for Seattle is to reallocate these resources to another part of their team. But it sounds like there's another avenue here where, basically if this results in them re-signing DK Metcalf, that could actually be a good thing.
I think it could be a good thing. I mean, I think it could be fine. I think DK Metcalf is a good player. You just have to figure out where your line in the sand is with this. Like, are you willing to pay that sort of premium and willing to pay at the top of the market for somebody that is a good but not great player? I think that's ultimately the question that you have to ask yourself. Like, where does he fall in line in that hierarchy of receivers? If you think he's as good as those guys where you can't let him walk out of the building, then maybe you figure out a way to make this work. But I'm just not sure he's that level player where you can turn down a pick and the cap savings that you would potentially get from this.
What do you think the best case scenario is for the Seahawks here? What's a realistic best case scenario? And include in that, like, timing. Is this something where you think that their best move is to make this move soon? Or is it to, play poker all the way through the draft? What's your thought on that? And what do you think the best outcome is here for Seattle?
I still think it's probably getting a proper return for him and using those resources elsewhere, right? Like, even if it's just getting draft capital for this year, so you could potentially understand what you need going into the draft. Like, do we have a need for a receiver, et cetera? Like, doing it in the summer when you've already figured out the rest of your roster and then you're hampering what you can be in 2025, that probably isn't my favorite outcome here.
So your team, the Chicago Bears, I always would love to touch on this because the Bears also have had a need. They went heavy with receiver. They had triple good receivers last year. They had plenty to go around. Wasn't that great because their offensive line was not that great. We know that story well here in Seattle. You've now gone out. First of all, the Bears have hired Ben Johnson, and then the Bears have traded a 6th-round pick for Jonah Jackson, who's familiar with Ben Johnson, and vice versa, and then traded a next year's 4th-round pick for Joe Thuney. What's your expectation? First of all, what's your reaction to what you're seeing from the Bears so far as they attack this offseason?
The word I've continued to come back to is it's aggressive. It is an aggressive approach to this. And I understand that when you look at the quality of offensive line play last year, where Ben Johnson comes from, and just saying, we need to get this fixed, even if we have to pay a premium to get it fixed. Like the Jonah Jackson move, that's a big contract to take on. I mean, there were people I talked to this week that are very familiar with the cap kind of situation, and they're like cap people that thought that the Rams might have to give someone a pick to take on the Jonah Jackson contract, let alone the Bears giving up one in exchange for him. So I think that's something that clearly shows what sort of urgency they have to get that thing fixed. And Joe Thuney's the same way. Like, Joe Thuney's 32 years old. He's a really good player, but giving up a 4th-round pick, even though it might not seem like a lot, that's a decent thing to give up for somebody who might have 1 or 2 years left. So I think it really speaks to how urgently they wanted to get this fixed and just making sure that no matter what, they were walking into this season feeling at least okay about the state of their offensive line.
Do you think that they will be in the market still when free agency opens next week to go out there and sign additional players for the line, like a Drew Dahlman or something along those lines?
Potentially. Yeah. I mean, if they somehow move the money around too, and if they want to like For example, Jonah Jackson has an $8.5 million roster bonus that's due in a few days. Do you turn that into a signing bonus? You split that in half. You give yourself $4 million more in cap space this year, whatever the math is. You can do the same thing with Joe Thuney if you want. You sign him to a small extension to get that number down, because it really does seem like they are hell bent on getting this figured out. So Dahlman would be the way for you to go into the draft with essentially no needs along your offensive line. It would free you up to do anything you wanted with the 10th overall pick, and then they have 3 picks in the top 41. So I wouldn't be surprised if they continue to be aggressive, because I think that they're sending a message with how they're handling this.
Okay, I have a question for you on behalf of all Seahawks fans. How does it feel? How does it feel for your team to be aggressive in addressing their offensive line?
It feels good in the sense that there's a certain level of comfort to it, but I think that you have to acknowledge the potential downside with stuff like this, right? If you look at the way that Ryan Poles has operated, he's traded away a lot of draft picks. Like, he traded away a 4th-round pick for Keenan Allen last year. This is a 4th-round pick for Joe Thuney next year. He has traded away a future 4th-round pick to move up to draft Austin Booker last year. They traded a 5th-round pick to go get Ryan Bates last year. So I appreciate the aggressiveness, but I also think that for the most part, good teams don't always operate this way. Like, you can thread the needle, and if you get lucky elsewhere, maybe it'll be fine. If Ben Johnson's the right guy, your margin for error becomes a little bit bigger than if he's not. But I still think that this is a potentially fruitful path, but one that absolutely comes with downsides that are worth recognizing.
Would you expect the Bears, with the moves that they've made so far, do you think that offensive line is still very much in play for them with their first pick in the draft?
Potentially, because Braxton Jones is going to be a free agent after this year. So if you're going to sit there and say, we know we don't want to pay him at the end of all of this, we would rather take the best player available. If that's Will Campbell with the 10th overall pick, you give yourself depth this year, and then you give yourself a starting left tackle potentially next year. If that's the guy they think is best for their long-term plan, I think that's fine. I think that is how good teams operate, where you're not picking a guy just to fill a hole immediately. This is a multi-year proposition. I think that's totally fine if they end up landing there. I also think if Braxton Jones plays well enough this year and we see kind of a middle class of tackle contracts start to form, Alaric Jackson being the best possible example, right? Like, he signs a deal that's pretty palatable for his starting left tackle. That market is starting to emerge a little bit. So if you feel like that's where it's going to settle, I can understand bringing him back on that sort of deal. But if you don't think he's your left tackle of the future, getting ahead of that right before it becomes a problem is potentially worthwhile.
Yeah, that was a sneaky good signing by the Rams. Alaric Jackson is not a household name, but he's really solidified himself as a reasonable starting left tackle, and the Rams got him for an understandable price. We were talking to Dane Brugler. It feels like ages ago. It was just yesterday morning, and I caught glimpses of you. The combine was hectic as all get out. I saw a million people there. I know what the combine is for Dane, but I don't know what the combine is for you. What is the combine week like? Dane told me his John Schneider story about excess and access. So I can't do the excess the way I might have a long time ago, but I'm curious, like, what is that week for you?
We do a lot of recordings with our writers when we're there, because all of our writers are there. So we feel like I've always felt like that's a good way to use our time and a way to populate the show over that week. So we had like 10, I think it was 12 different athletic writers on to kind of fill our shows that week. So I spent a lot of time at Radio Row doing those. And when I'm not doing that, we have a huge meeting on Monday. The Athletic does. It's essentially our like NFL summit. So there's meetings in the morning, and then there's like a happy hour for like 4 hours in the evening. And then from Tuesday to Friday, when I'm not doing recordings, I'm essentially catching up with coaches and other people in the league. So there was a time in my 20s where I used to tell myself that, I'll like network at night, like that's when I'll meet people, which is nonsense. Like you're not like some people can do that. That's not how I'm wired. Like I'm not like a schmoozer. Like I'm not going to be like, so what are you hearing about this? Just not something I'm going to do. And so for the most part, I now do like coffees and lunches. So Tuesday through Friday, I'll stack up, I don't know, a dozen conversations with coaches and personnel people, some that I know, some that I don't know, and just catch up with people and get a sense of how they're thinking about their teams, how they're thinking about the league, and just using it as a way to maintain those connection points, I guess is what I would say. So it's a hectic week for me. I mean, from 9 a.m. until 4 or 5 p.m. every single day, I'm running from one thing to the next. I mean, that's just kind of how indie is, where I finish a recording, it's like, thanks guys, and then just run to a coffee or a lunch or a sit down of some kind. So that's pretty much how it goes these days.
What are the types of things that you walk away with from those conversations?
Oh, it's all over the place. Like truly all over the place. Like sometimes it's, what a team is thinking about its off season. Even though it's not really how I talk to people. Like, well, what are you gonna do with this? Is like, whether it's because I'm not interested in it or it's just not how I operate. Like I always tell people like I don't really trade in information. Like that's not my currency. And so my conversations with people are probably a little bit different. But I had a conversation with the head coach last week, and we were just a whole bunch of like theoretical things. And we were talking about the differences in the game planning processes from building to building. Like how involved is your staff if you're a play calling offensive head coach? When do you start being involved in the process? How do you solicit ideas from other people? How do you filter out those ideas? Like what does the actual process look like from day to day? Stuff like that. Just talking about how I had a conversation with another head coach about scouting quarterbacks. How do you do it? Right? Like if the idea is processing and feel is the most important thing at the position, how do you get a sense of that when you walk away from an interaction with one of these guys? When you're going through a play, I've never had someone say this to me before, but I thought it was a particularly interesting observation. When you're going through a play and he makes a decision that maybe seems a little bit strange, but ultimately was good, and you ask a quarterback, why did you do that? Sometimes the best answer is, I don't know. Right? Because that shows that you're not intellectualizing the position. You feel space, you feel where you should go with the ball. So just stuff like that. It's just like, how do these guys think? How do they approach their jobs? And especially with young coaches who I've never met before, it's definitely something where I want to get a sense of like, what is your day to day? So like, if you're the X team passing game coordinator, what does your week actually look like? When you're game planning, what are you responsible for? Is it red zone? Is it third down? Like, how do you go about that? What are you looking for? How do you present it to the team? Do you present it to the team? So just getting to know those guys and like how they operate, because inevitably when those assistants are getting interviewed for offensive coordinator jobs, I would hopefully like to be able to have some level of insight about who those guys are and just like where they come from and what they believe.
How and we're talking to Robert Mays of the Athletic for a few more minutes. How varied are the answers to those types of things?
Oh,
Like
it's all
how
over the place.
it's so different in how people approach those things?
It's all over the place. It just depends on your head coach, and I'll feel comfortable sharing this. But so the Browns do this thing where they have a sheet of paper, and some people do it on the iPad, some people do it with like physical paper, and they're for each individual thing. So red zone, third down, whatever. There's 6 boxes, and each assistant coach has a chance to fill out those 6 boxes with 6 plays he likes for that particular situation. And then they gather all of those and then they give them to the offensive coordinator and the head coach. And the offensive coordinator and the head coach can determine which of those plays they like and which ones they don't. And if there's enough of them that show up often enough as part of the process, you put them in the game plan. Right. So that's just how one team does it. But there are some teams where, I've heard stories where the head coach and the offensive coordinator go into a room on Monday, they come out on Monday night, and they're like, "This is the game plan." So it's all over the place, and so how teams go about that and why is really interesting. I had some really interesting conversations this year about how intentional some staffs are about figuring out the learning methods of their players. Like they give them tests early in the season, like, are you a kinesthetic learner? Are you an oral learner? Are you somebody that likes things visually where I'm drawing it out for you? And so just these things that you don't really think about, but end up becoming really, really important considerations for coaching staffs day to day. I find that stuff fascinating. And so I find that's typically where those conversations go.
Do you find yourself getting the itch sometimes to open up your laptop and start writing an article like you used to about these kinds of topics and get deep on it?
My hope is that we can filter a lot of this stuff into the podcast that I am tasked with doing. That is my responsibility. So as we get into the off season and we get away from the rigors of the schedule, are there enough big picture things that we can do where, we can have 4 or 5 different shows that kind of talk about stuff like this? I think that's what May and June are for.
So we will get you out of here. One last question. Importantly, Pete Carroll sat in my row on the flight to the combine, and he did.
He was in coach.
He was in coach in the exit row. Yes. It was. This was an amazing flight, Robert. This conversation for another time. But he thinks that his Bluetooth headphones are connected to his phone. They're not, and his music starts blaring out of his phone for a good 30 seconds before he realized what was going on. And I can make you.
What was he listening to?
I was going to make you guess. It was. Well, what do you think? Give me one quick guess.
It's either like Steely Dan or like Kendrick Lamar. It's either like something like old man thing, or it's the coolest thing he could possibly be listening to.
It was definitely not Kendrick Lamar, but it was. I would say it was somewhere between bluegrass and folk. A little bit upbeat, but that was what I heard. And so I got this little window into Pete Carroll. It was very funny, and I got to watch him the whole flight. I was not like doing that, but I got to see him. But you drive to the combine, yes?
I do.
If we were in your car and we were able to hear what was going on in your car, what would we hear?
What was I listening to on the way home? I listened to podcasts, but not a lot of football podcasts. So I listened to an episode, I think, or 2 of Plain English, which is a Ringer podcast I really like that Derek Thompson does from The Atlantic. It's probably my favorite podcast. And then music. We're literally, when I got home from the combine this year, I had an hour to switch out my suitcases and then go to the airport with my wife. We went to a music festival in Miami last weekend with her parents. And so I was listening to some of the things that we were going to be checking out that weekend. So it was probably a combination of those 2.
Love it. Robert, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. Really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your week, and good luck with free agency next week. I know it's going to be crazy.
I'm looking forward to it. It's one of my favorite weeks of the whole calendar. Like it requires no thought. It's just like something happens and then you just react to it. And to me, that's like my favorite thing to do. It requires no preparation. It's all just like word vomit as things are happening. So that's a version of the job that I typically embrace.
Love it. Love it. Make sure you follow Robert Mays. And Robert, thanks again for coming on the show.
See ya.
All right. That was Robert Mays of The Athletic. One of the best, if not the best in the business. And you hear why in that conversation. I mean, the conversations that he's having with coaches and people in, personnel departments is, amazing. I think all of us would love to be a fly on the wall for those conversations. And part of the reason he's able to get to that point is you heard him specifically say that Robert doesn't trade in information. That's not his currency. And I'm not comparing myself to Robert Mays at all, but I made that decision a long time ago when I started doing this, and I actually started getting, relationships with players and scouts and coaches and front office people. And I started getting access to information that if I were to share it would be a bombshell. And I was like, I don't want to be a newsbreaker. I don't want to be the person who has the story. 1, because I think that's a pretty stressful existence. 2, you're generally going to end up burning those people at one point and having you're going to piss somebody off. And it's just not, I like a little bit more harmony in my life than that. So, I've always decided I'm going to have access to information wherever I can get it, but I'm going to use that to help inform my opinions and my analysis as things unfold. So, generally, actually, someone asked me on Twitter yesterday, like, is this something that you're saying you've got sources saying this is the case or not? I'll just say this for all of you. Nothing that I will share publicly is sourced unless I specifically call out that it's sourced. There will be some times where I'll specifically say, hey, I think the team believes this, or I think, this player's camp would believe that. And in those situations, I'm referencing some actual conversations. But for the most part, what I do here is provide analysis. I provide what I think they're doing and why they're doing it, and I try to anticipate why that might happen or why it might not. but I'm not going to try to break news. It's just it's not a business that I'm particularly interested in. And the people that do it, great. I like to benefit from that information, but not be at front of the line for it. So the reason is taking this all the way back to Robert. The reason that's relevant is he wouldn't be able to have the conversations he's having with coaches. I don't think he'd be going over to their houses like he did with Sean McVay last year for the interview he did, which was fantastic, if he was really looking to trade in information and to be breaking stories. He's able to get to an understanding of how people think, what makes them tick, what's trending across the league, what are the types of questions that are being asked and answered, because he is not then taking that information and sharing it with another team or sharing it online or anything like that. And so one of the things part of the reason his show is so excellent, the Athletic Football Show, I think it's the best football podcast out there. And I'm not even sure it's close, is because he is coming from a highly informed and highly intelligent point of view on a game that he loves. And I think that shows up every time I talk to Robert. I think it shows up every time I listen to Robert. And it's why, really fortunate this year to have Pagliacci sponsor Robert as our weekly guest. And you heard him earlier on in the season when I mentioned that was a December 23rd clip where he talked about the fact that DK Metcalf, it's probably the best thing for the Seahawks if they take DK Metcalf and they reallocate those resources, not just the draft capital you could get in a trade, but also the salary cap space that you would save and not spend on an extension elsewhere in the roster. And the interesting thing is you kind of heard him listening to himself, and he almost started arguing against himself a little bit, or his past self, because now he's in the mindset of like, you're not going to get what you're asking for DK Metcalf in a trade. You're not going to get a first and a third. And I don't know. I generally don't believe that the Seahawks are going to get a first and a third for DK Metcalf. Let's be clear about that. I think that Robert kept saying a first and a fourth, but it was a first and a third, just to be clear. So I don't necessarily think that they're going to get a first and a third. I disagree with Robert that the Brandon Ayuk comp from last year is not a good one. The reason is I actually can get to the point where he is of saying, hey, Brandon Ayuk was younger and maybe better. Let's say I don't fully agree with that, the better part, but let's just say, sure, Brandon Ayuk had just be coming off a career year, ascending player, get it. But here's where I think if there is that gap between Ayuk and Metcalf from a generic value perspective, in a vacuum perspective, the market's very different than it was last year. I just think that there are going to be teams that are desperate for a receiver that were not last year, or that they had other options. There were so many receivers in that class last year. There was receivers in free agency. There's a lot of options to get a receiver. And I just don't think there are that many this year. And so if there is a gap, I think that helps close it. And the other thing that I think helps close it is that I really do believe there are not always the brightest, sharpest minds that have no emotion and no pressure from ownership invading their minds that are in charge of these decisions. And DK Metcalf, if you look at DK Metcalf as an athlete, there's no comparison between him and Brandon Ayuk. Honestly, Brandon Ayuk's a really good receiver, but DK Metcalf is an otherworldly athlete, and teams salivate for that kind of player. He is also a guy that has a high fan engagement. Like, he will be the top jersey sale when you trade for him. He's a guy that every owner is going to be excited to add. You're not going to have to justify it. So do I think that means that they're going to offer, the top draft capital? Not necessarily. But do I think that it starts to be comparable to Brandon Ayuk last year? Yeah, I actually do. And so there's been more conversation about what the draft compensation could be, or what all those things could be. I think we're going to still hear it. The timing of this is interesting. There's a number of folks that are saying they think this could happen within a few days. That would surprise me, to be honest. But the other part of this story that I think continues to develop, and if you heard Albert Breer, I think Albert Breer was on with Brock and Salk this morning. And one of the things he said was the team is still maybe hoping that this will be a Matthew Stafford kind of situation where DK comes back around to them. That's the first I think I've heard someone say it that clearly. We talked about it on Real Hawk Talk last night. Evan was giving the Seahawks all this credit for making the move, and this is a big move that could really help reshape the franchise. And I'm like, not so fast. I don't think this is a move the Seahawks want to make. And I started the emergency pod yesterday with saying, hey, I will always tell you when I got something wrong, and I got something wrong. When I said DK Metcalf was not going anywhere, I got that wrong. I might not have been wrong. Like the part that I think I most miscalculated was the DK Metcalf angle of this. I think I underestimated his level of unrest, and I think I may have underestimated the potential for the Seahawks to play hardball on the contract that they're willing to offer him. And at the same time, I actually think more and more and more that I was spot on in terms of evaluating what the Seahawks wanted, what Mike McDonald wants, what John Schneider wants, what Clint Kubiak wants. I think they all want DK Metcalf on this team. And so I don't think this soap opera is even close to its conclusion. It's going to be really interesting. DK Metcalf, it was a choice, an intentional choice to put the words prefers a contender in this leak. I think there's a lot of implications of that. And I think that could potentially lead into, is that going to box him in? Like I said, he went on the Katie Nolan podcast a few weeks ago. If you want, you can go back and listen to that. And Katie Nolan is trying to convince him to come to New England. This is well before the trade thing. And he's like, that's not a place I want to live. He's like, franchise is great, not a place I want to live. That's out there already. He doesn't want to go to New England. I think we're all pretty sure he wants to go to Southern California. That is where he spends his time. He has become a Hollywood guy. He's in a lot of shows and movies and commercials. That's where I think he wants to be. There's only a few choices down there, and pretty sure the Seahawks aren't going to trade him to the Rams. And I don't think they're going to trade him to the 49ers, not that that's in Southern California. So the Chargers are kind of glaring there. I think the Raiders almost fit into that. But DK Metcalf's going to have a choice to make, because the team that's probably willing to pay him the most money is probably not going to be a contender. And so is he going to choose the money and the highest bid, or is he going to choose the team that maybe is closest to where he wants it to be, both geographically and from a level of contention? So, I mean, does he want to go to Green Bay and play in that weather? Does he want to live in Green Bay? That's a closer team to contention. You can make the case they're definitely closer than the Seahawks, at least last year. Will he accept that? I don't know. I think that's going to be fast. The Patriots, I think, are going to be a team that's willing to offer both in trade compensation and in salary more than most. Now, we just saw the Houston Texans make a deal for Christian Kirk for a 7th-round pick. Very, very different situation. Christian Kirk, barely played last year. I think he was injured. The team was going to cut him. Instead of cutting him, they get a 7th-round pick. That's not this situation. But the Texans are no longer probably looking for another receiver. And we're going to see what happens, like Devontae Adams. I wouldn't be surprised if next week free agency is a key moment. There are teams out there that think they're going to get one of these free agent receivers. and they're going to see what the price tag is of these free agent receivers. Chris Godwin, Devontae Adams, DeAndre Hopkins, and so forth. And so I think it's probably realistic that the first wave of free agency will happen before a deal for the Seahawks comes to fruition for DK Metcalf, because these teams are going to have an opportunity to really test the value of what they're willing to spend on these other free agents. And then they're going to be staring in the face. Someone's going to get those players, and other teams are not. And those teams that are left empty-handed are now going to be staring at the draft and saying, oh my gosh, are we going to be able to get what we need there? And then you're going to have a real conversation about, that 23rd pick or that 28th pick that you've got. Are you really going to get a DK Metcalf level player in this draft where there's really like 9 to 10 true first round players? So what you're really giving up, like, I can imagine the conversation. If I'm John Schneider, I'm like, yes, technically it's a first round pick, but in this year's draft, if it's in the 20s, that's a second round pick. So, let's not be precious about calling it a first. This is getting requisite value. In any other year, if this was last year, sure, I'd take a second round pick, because a second round pick is actually a second round pick. This year, your pick in the 20s is a second round pick. So give me one of those. Not saying it's going to work, but that's absolutely going to be the conversation. And there's going to be teams next week that are empty-handed at the receiver spot, and they're going to be trying to figure out, can we really do better than DK Metcalf? And imagine if you listen to Hard Knocks, the offseason edition with the Giants and Joe Shane, and you saw how many times the owner, Mara, went in there and literally talked about Saquon Barkley. He's our top jersey sale. He knows how popular that player is with the team. And the amount of pressure on Joe Shane to make those decisions. It is going to be so tempting for a GM. It's not going to be hard to make a sale to the owner to say, we want to go trade for DK Metcalf and we want to pay him. That is not going to be a hard sale. The hard sale is going to be, in their own minds, are they selling themselves down the river? Because if this doesn't work, if he does not take us to where we want to go, it's probably my job. Like, that's for, in some of these cases, that could be the case. I continue to think Robert didn't agree. And I think I take his opinion I give his opinion a lot of weight. I still think Baltimore makes a lot of sense. I know that there's some salary stuff that have to be worked out, but they have cap room next year. There's a chance they actually have a situation in their own cap where Marlon Humphrey's cap number is a problem this year. Is there a chance that Marlon Humphrey's part of a deal? Not saying that that's perfect, exactly what you want, but obviously Mike McDonald knows Marlon Humphrey. Now Josh Jobe is coming back, which is great, but I don't think that means that they're done at the cornerback position. Maybe this is like really stretching things. Maybe it's DK Metcalf and Reek Woolen. And then you're talking about some serious draft capital if Marlon Humphrey's coming back. I mean, I don't think Mark Andrews makes a lot of sense because of his age, but he's a cap situation. I think Isaiah Likely at tight end is an interesting young tight end. So I don't think the Baltimore thing is crazy to me, but we're going to find out. We're going to find out together. And I think that more so than yesterday, I think the probability that the Seahawks end up with DK Metcalf at the end of this is higher than I think people are estimating. And I'll tell you, like, one of the odds that just came out, this came out from Sportsbook Review. Take it for what it's worth. I don't know how good their work is. They said the most likely team that DK Metcalf ends up with, the Seattle Seahawks. They give it a 27% chance that he ends up with the Seahawks. So the next most likely is the Chargers at 24%, then the Patriots at 18%, the Raiders at 15%, the Steelers at 13%, and then it drops pretty low to the Giants at 8%. And then the Broncos, the Jags, the Bears. I don't know why the Bears would make that move. But in any event, the Packers aren't all the way down at 6%. So, and at least by these odds, the Seahawks are the most likely team to end up with DK Metcalf. And I'm wondering for all of you, I'd love to see this in chat. With it now out there, are you going to feel better if the announcement comes out that DK Metcalf has been traded? And let's say, just for the sake of making it realistic, let's say it's what Robert said, a second round pick. A second, and sure, throw in like a fifth, something like that. Not a first, second and a fifth, something like that for DK Metcalf. Would you be more happy if the announcement came out that the Seahawks made that move, or that the Seahawks have extended DK Metcalf for $32 million a year? If you had the choice and you listened to your own heart and those two possibilities of announcement came out, which one would you be happier about? And which one, if either of them, would you be disappointed in? Where you'd be like, oh man. Because I've talked to fans that are all over the place on this. And Robert's right that we've talked about this on our show. Just because you get the draft capital back or the cap space back does not mean you're going to use those resources to replace what you lost. It's pretty hard to do with a guy like DK Metcalf. So looking at chat, we got second would be excellent. Let's see. If it's a high second and whatever fifth, I'd prefer that to extending DK. I'd take a second and change personally. Old school says a trade. Depends on where the second round is. If it's a high second round, I'd be fine with it. Second and a player, yes. 32 million would be disastrous. I would take the second and a fifth, but really try for a first rounder next year. API was 32 is what I said, yes. I would rather they made the move, which I assume is the trade. Extend him because JSN will get exposed as the only receiver. Second for sure. 32 million is too much for DK as much as I love him. I'd be pissed. We need to get a QB next year. I don't know what you'd be pissed about. If that means the trade or the extension. Tyler says extend him. I won't like the pick that we get. Hans says team building wise, you should trade him. Personally, as a fan, pay him. He is the best player to cheer for. So, like I said, you got people all over the place. And so it sounds like Josina Anderson has made another report. Like, is it actually is it actually worth even reading? Let's see. I'm pulling up the latest here. Oh, the Jags. Okay, Mitch Morse is retired. Just reading some news here. Chargers officially released Joey Bosa. Got it. Let me get to Josina's piece here. Says a follow-up to yesterday. She said that there's a team willing to give at least a third-round pick for DK, which is a silly thing to say. She says follow-up. Same league source just told me right now the Seahawks want too much for DK Metcalf in their opinion. Sounds like this particular team will circle back. Okay, I mean, this is the staring match. And here's the thing, like, I'll say it without much hesitation. DK Metcalf is not one of the best receivers in football. He's not one of the 20 best receivers in football. I think that there's a fair amount of evidence to back that up. I don't think that a first and a third is a reasonable compensation for DK Metcalf from a team acquiring him, especially when they're also going to pay him. I'll also say, I think that's the exactly right starting position for the Seahawks to have. And I think the Seahawks, this is one of those times where someone could blink. I really think it could. If we hear that the Seahawks made a trade for DK Metcalf for like a third and a fifth or a third and a player, it is a disaster if that's what happens. So I'm telling you right now, I think there is zero chance that DK Metcalf is moved for less than a second. And beyond that, I think there's a reasonable chance. I'm not saying it's the most likely, but I think some team is going to look at DK Metcalf and say, "Okay, we're all in. We'll do it." Don't know what that's going to look like, but John Schneider has to do his best work here. He has to have his best poker face. And I know a lot of people are really critical of John. What I would say is, in contract negotiations and holdouts, he has held his water every single time. Every single time. It could be Marshawn Lynch. It could be Cam Chancellor. Doesn't matter how good of a player, how important of a player, how important of a part of the season, he holds his water. And so I don't see John Schneider just sitting there taking whatever is given. I think John Schneider is willing to play this out as long as it needs to. And I think DK Metcalf's camp will probably make more and more noise to try to force leverage. I don't think it's going to matter. Ultimately, I think John will wait for a deal that makes sense to him or find a way to get DK back to the table. I think those are the most likely outcomes. I think the Seahawks getting really bad return is honestly the least likely outcome. And if it happens, I'll be here to talk about it and rip it, because this is, what did I call this offseason? For those who've been listening, it is the McGyver, McGruber offseason. With Geno, with DK, with his offensive line, with a new coaching staff in its second year, a new offensive coordinator, new offensive line coaches. This is either you're going to defuse the bomb and be McGyver and save the day, or you're going to be fumbling and the timer's going to go off and boom, everything is gone. John Schneider's gone. Everything is gone. So this is it. This is it, where we get to find out what the future of the Seahawks is for at least the next few years. This one move, to me, much more so than the Geno Smith decision and extension and whatever happens there, this move with DK Metcalf will make or break whether the Seahawks are going to get out of purgatory on the upward swing, or they might get out of purgatory on the downward side. Everyone's complaining about 9 or 10 wins. You may wish for 9 or 10 wins if this thing goes wrong. So I find this to be an incredibly engaging time to be a Seahawks fan, because there is a lot of goodness in the locker room, in the young roster, with a coaching staff that gained traction and turned around a defense and started to get more and more out of them. There's a lot of young ascending players. I think they've got the right offensive play caller now and the right system and the right offensive line coaching staff to help maximize the players they've got. I think they've got the right draft that has the right players for them to really turn around this line. I think depending on what happens in free agency next week, that can be another a piece of the puzzle. So there is a real opportunity for this to be the McGyver offseason. And just like McGyver, I don't care what tools you use to get it done. Trade, draft, free agency, whatever. Just get it done. So with that, let me get to some super chats, and we'll see. We got Bryce Coots always with his generosity. 10 Hawk Blogger memberships. Really unbelievable streak Bryce is on with all the memberships he's given away. Thank you for that, Bryce. Dave Esp. I don't know if I've seen Dave before. At least I don't recognize the name, but welcome to the party, and thank you for your generosity. He's given away 10 Hawk Blogger memberships. If you want to get one of these memberships, all you got to do is make sure you got gifting turned on your YouTube account, and make sure that you are engaging with the show. Like it, subscribe, all those good things. The people that are most engaged are who YouTube will gift these memberships to. Six Riley says, what are the chances of a huge reunion in Las Vegas? Yeah, I assume you're talking about, this could be Russell Wilson and DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. This could be Geno Smith and DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. But one of the fascinating things I think is, what if there is a chance that the Seahawks put Geno Smith and DK Metcalf together and send them to the Raiders? Will DK Metcalf be like, dude, I was trying to get away from this guy? Like, I'm not sure. I'm not reporting that. I don't know that there's any friction there. But I will tell you, I have never heard DK Metcalf talk about Geno Smith the way he talks about Russell Wilson. Take that for what it's worth. Might mean nothing. But he talks about Russell Wilson with reverence. I don't hear that when he talks about Geno Smith. So it would be kind of ironic if they both got moved to a team like the Raiders. Thanks for that super chat, Six Riley. Tyler Morano, who's been a member for a month. Good to have you, Tyler. Says, what wide receiver would you want from free agency? I will tell you, Tyler. That's a good question, and my answer is none of them. Do not go out and spend free agent dollars on the wide receiver position. Just don't do it. I don't like having to spend. Generally, it's not a good idea to spend money in free agency overall, let alone in a position group that is low on talent and high on age. You have a chance to get young and cheap. So what I would like to see is the Seahawks get a pick, and I'll show you. We'll do a quick mock draft. I will show this to you guys because I did one yesterday. I think the chances for you to get something interesting out of this at the receiver position in the draft is what I'd go after. If I was really like pressured, Diami Brown is a guy that I like, 25 years old. He could be someone, I think he showed up nicely in the playoffs. Maybe Tutu Atwell, who was a D Eskridge right after D Eskridge or right before, I can't remember. He's a free agent and I think has a little spice to his game. And these guys should be really cheap. But I don't want to hear any of the old heads. I don't want to see any of those guys in this. All right, we've got super chat from Liam Marshall, 2nd, 3rd, and Joe Milton from New England. I mean, I'd do that deal. I would do that deal. I don't know if New England will do that deal. I don't know if the Seahawks would take that deal, but I would do that deal. I think that's a great deal, Liam. Jason Sass, just empty super chat. I'm assuming he's just saying thank you, but I appreciate it, Jason, for all of that. Tutu re-signed for 1 year, $10 million. Sorry. Appreciate the update. I was out today, so I haven't had a chance to see all of that. But I mean, 1 year, $10 million. Honestly, I wouldn't want the Seahawks to spend that much money on the receivers position. So that's more than I would have even guessed. All right. You know what? I lied. I'm not going to do a mock draft today. I'll do that tomorrow. But I think that when you start playing around with what it would mean to get a 2nd and maybe a 3rd from a team, you got a chance to get some interesting receivers in this class. And hopefully I'll get a chance to talk to some of those receivers and we'll be able to get to know them better. Speaking of which, tomorrow morning at, let me double check when it is tomorrow morning. So I'll probably be doing the show around 7:30. I might do it at 8, but at 8 a.m., one way or another, I'll be talking to Willie Lampkin, the North Carolina player who Had a great Senior Bowl, really impressive, and really looking forward to catching up with him. He did not get invited to the combine, which I think was a travesty. I would have loved to see him at the combine. So we're going to talk to Willie Lampkin tomorrow. And I just heard from another agent on another opportunity. Going to be talking to defensive tackle Jordan Phillips of Maryland, one of my favorite players that I had a chance to talk to at the combine. This is a guy I think really, really impressive guy. Would love to get him on the show. So I will let you know. We're going to keep having as many of these guys as are willing come on the show. I think Jonas Avanaya yesterday was awesome. If you missed that show, make sure you go check it out. But I really, really loved that conversation. All right, everybody. That'll do it for this edition of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I'm Brian Nemhauser. This is episode 346. We will be back tomorrow for episode 347 with Willie Lampkin. Take care, y'all.